Hello everyone. I am Alice of KHR Arts and Cloud Orchid Publishing, and today we are going to talk about how to avoid continuity errors in your writing. So this is a really big one that can slip through the cracks. It's something that a lot of writers struggle with, that a lot of editors who are worth their salt are going to point out to you. And here's some ways that you can catch those without having to really rack your brain. Today we're going to talk about my novel, Succumb to Darkness. It is currently completely finished, and I'm currently pitching it to literary agents. But the reason why I'm using this as an example today is because this particular story had a lot of different components that I had to regularly keep track of, and I'm going to share with y'all some of the strategies I used in order to ensure that I didn't suffer from the pitfall of continuity errors. Some of the more simple things that I had to keep track of in Succumb to Darkness was eye colors. Now, in a lot of YouTube videos about how to write and how to create characters and things like that, a lot of them are going to tell you no one cares what color your character's eyes are. And for the most part, that's true. A big pitfall that people will make is that they will describe their character from head to toe, and most of these details the reader doesn't care about. However, in Succumb to Darkness, eye color is an actual important detail. And part of this is because I note that when vampires transform from being mortals, or in Evangela's case, being an angel transforming into a vampire, their eye color changes. And it changes to something that is not a typical human eye color. So things like violet or red, or it's colorless completely. All of those details are important because it reminds the reader that these are in fact not humans, they are vampires. And keeping track of what color whoever's eyes are was a big continuity error thing. And so how I kept track of this is as I've mentioned in my previous video, how to stay organized, I have these notes programs on my computer. It's literally just the old school notes program where it's just a little window that comes up and it only accepts text. A lot of programmers use it in order to write programming language in it. I personally use them for different random catch-all thoughts and details and keeping track of specific continuity details for my different novels. And I always save those files for those particular novels so that I can make sure that I find them again. And this particular notes file that I had included making sure that I labeled, okay, Amishamin's eye color is this, Verseau's eye color is this, Angela's eye color is this, and having that to reference to make sure that I'm keeping track of everyone's eye color made life so much easier instead of relying on myself to remember every chapter, every page, whose eye color was what. Having something that I could reference made that so much easier, and it also made it easier on me when I was going through editing to ensure that I caught all the times that I did put the incorrect color, that I could refer back to that to make sure, okay, yes, this is the correct color, or no, I've written the wrong color here and I need to change that. In that same vein of colors, I also assign colors being important to particular characters, in that was a big thing with nobility, is assigning colors to different members of the nobility, such as in the early days of Versailles, Louis the Sun King, his color was red. Red was seen as the royal color, in that only nobility could afford rouge, which was very expensive. And so they prominently put rouge on their faces. For those of y'all that don't know what rouge is, it's blush. So the big stereotypical circles of blush, that's where that came from, was that trend in Versailles. It was also a big thing that only nobility were allowed to wear shoes that had red heels on them. That was just an assigned thing. But Louis's younger brother decided that he wanted to stand out, and he assigned for himself the color blue. And so everything that he wore was featuring prominently blue. As well as with different noble families, the family crest and the family colors, things like that, all of those things are oftentimes also very important to them as a family, them as a person, prominently showcasing those colors, such as France back then, their colors were blue and gold, whereas Britain, their colors were red and gold. So, featuring that prominently in their clothing, their decorations around their castles and palaces, all that kind of stuff was very important to them and their families. And Succumb to Darkness, the characters are the same. Verseau, I assigned him the color red, keeping in line with that idea of Versailles, that red was seen as the royal color, as well as this story parallels the late days of Versailles and the French Revolution, so of course I'm going to keep in line with a lot of those traditional historical colors. Amishimen is assigned the color purple. And a big part of that is because traditionally, in a lot of cultures across history, purple is seen as a very regal color. And a big part of that, again, is because of the scarcity. To dye anything purple was very expensive because that particular color of dye was very rare to create and buy. And Evanangela is assigned the color blue. And I did this for two traditional reasons. One, again, because of the younger brother of Louis the Sun King chose his color to be blue, because Evanangela is technically below Verseau and Amishimen. I have her with blue to denote that she is not quite on the same level as the two of them, and a big part of that is mainly due to her inexperience. But it is also because traditionally back then, the roles of gender color were reversed in that blue was for girls and red was for boys. And the reason for this was that red and pink were seen as the colors of blood, the colors of battle. They were very exciting colors, as they called it, exciting. And blue was seen as a more peaceful and calm color, which was more appropriate for girls and women. And so I also gave her this because Evanangela is definitely far more peaceful than Amishimen and Verseau. And again, a big part of that is because her past as an angel rather than as a human, and also with her inexperience in that she doesn't approach the feeds and approach her thinking about mortals the same way that the other vampires do, due to her past experiences and her internal conflict with her desire to be forgiven and possibly taken back to heaven, all that kind of stuff. So giving her that assigned color of blue was important characterization. And how those colors were personified in the story was anything and everything. It was the color of the handkerchiefs they carried. It was the clothing they wore. It was the decor of their personal apartments. Even so far as the colors featured for the carriages they rode in. All of that was tied into their characters. So making sure that Amishimen wasn't suddenly riding in a blue carriage for no reason, or Evanangela wasn't suddenly carrying around red handkerchiefs and things like that. Again, I added that to the list to make sure that I remembered those color codes that went with those characters to ensure the things assigned to them made sense. Now, a lot of these picky details are the things that people most often have issues with in terms of continuity errors. A lot of times the big glaring things are easier for you to catch, especially during the editing process, but it's these tiny details that can really escape your attention. So having these kinds of keys and even charts that you create for yourself can really help you to make sure that you don't miss those picky little details and then suddenly have a reader leaving you an Amazon review, God forbid, or messaging you or whatever to let you know, hey, why did you suddenly have this character, up until page 90, their eyes were blue and now they're suddenly green. What's going on? Because when you change details like that, the reader will pick up on it and think it's important, when honestly you just forgot what color eyes they had. So having those kinds of lists for yourself can be really helpful in avoiding those kind of picky continuity errors. Another really helpful thing that I use are charts. And what I mean by charts are any sort of diagram sort of thing, such as family trees, maps, or any sort of other relation information that you need. With maps, with the fantasy series that I'm currently working on, that is a current NDA for me, having maps that I have drawn to be able to not only navigate the entire world that I've created, but also navigate the individual lands of this world, and knowing physically where things are in the world really, really helps. Because if I say that a character is traveling eastward toward whatever area, and it turns out on the map that it's westward, it's going to make absolutely zero sense. And I know that a lot of readers are not necessarily going to catch these kinds of things. It just really helps with laying out your story, that if you, the author, physically know where things are located, and if a character is traveling, where things are, about how long that journey should probably take, etc., things like that, it's one, going to make your world way more believable, and two, it's just really going to help you with understanding how your world works. So if you lay out the map and you see that town A is next to town B, but town C is way over here, it's going to make absolutely zero sense if you say, okay, it took one day for them to travel from town A to town B, and then you try to say it only takes one day to travel from town B to town C, when town C is way over here, and then later on in the book you say it takes a week to travel from town B to town C. That's a huge continuity error, and it's something that you want to keep track of. And having something like a map that you can physically reference is going to really help you with those kind of details. As well as that's a continuity error I've seen with other writers, in that locations will move around in their story, and a big part of that is just because they just don't know where it is. So maybe in one chapter they'll say that location A is next to location D, and then in another chapter they'll say that location A is next to location B, and location D is all the way over here next to location F. And then you're like, wait, whoa, what just happened? Where are we? And that can be very jarring and confusing for the reader if things seem to be moving where locations are actually located. So that's just a really easy way to cut out that kind of continuity error. Another useful chart in terms of relations for where things are located, what characters have to do with things, all that kind of stuff, is family trees. Can be super helpful, especially if you're writing a historical fiction and you're trying to keep track of who's related to who, who's married to who, all that kind of stuff. And for, again, my fantasy series that I'm working on, that's a really important piece of the puzzle for me in, again, figuring out who's related to who, who's married to who, and then also in the mythological lore, keeping track of all those mythological figures and what their relation is to these other mythological figures, and just all of that jazz. Having some sort of chart, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a family tree, it can just even be some sort of relational chart, such as this character is friends with this character, but this character is rivals with this character, but that rival is also friends with this character, and whatever. When you start to have those kind of triangles going on and stuff, it makes it a lot easier if you actually have a physical chart to look at, to keep track of who likes who, who's an enemy, who's a friend, and all that kind of stuff, with figuring out all of those character development plots and conflicts and things in your story. So I highly recommend having some sort of physical way to keep track of all that, so that all of a sudden you don't have these two characters in chapter 1 hate each other, and then for no reason whatsoever they're suddenly best friends in chapter 4, simply because you forgot who's friends with who, with no character development there. That is very jarring and confusing. And I know that sounds like Captain Obvious, but it does happen more often than you think, especially with secondary and background characters. The last one that is the most challenging and honestly most frustrating continuity error is the plot and character development. Now, again, these sound like Captain Obvious, but when you are in the weeds and you are in the thick of working on a book, it can be really easy to have things in your head, but they're not necessarily presented correctly on the page. And one of the ways that I solved this type of continuity problem is by physical sticky notes of every single scene in the story. So what I do is I take a stack of sticky notes, and on each one I write something very simple. I keep everything as simplified as possible because you're going to have an entire wall full of sticky notes when you do this exercise. And basically, what you do is you say, okay, chapter 1, scene 1, this happens. And then, okay, the next scene, they went from the castle to the garden. And then the next scene, they were in the garden and now they're talking to this character or whatever. So you just go play by play through your entire story and make sure that the continuity makes sense. So that one, you don't have characters seemingly teleporting to random places, and two, to making sure that things make sense scene wise so that you don't necessarily jump back and forth in time unless that's intentional. And you also don't suddenly have things that are basically impossible. So let's say character A is all the way at the tippy top of the castle in the atrium, and you have character B all the way in the bottom in the dungeons, and they're doing separate things, and then suddenly in the next scene, they're both in the Great Hall having a conversation. Now, you can jump to something like that, but if you say that they suddenly met there in the span of 5 minutes, that's physically impossible. So just making sure that all of those things make sense in your story with physical locations, with character development, with what's physically happening in the plot, with physical timeline things, with making sure that you know where you're at in space and time, all that kind of stuff. That sticky note exercise is really super helpful. And I have used that for most of my novels that I've written. It's also super helpful if you are rewriting something that you've already written. So if you're like, I need to rip this apart, if you use this sticky note exercise, it's going to make it a lot easier to rip apart your story and decide where it makes more sense to have different chapters and different scenes, and maybe even deciding, you know what, I don't need this scene, it's repetitive, or, you know, I need to make sure I add a scene in between these things because right now they don't make any sense. I need this buffer scene in between. All that kind of stuff. It really helps you to really examine with a really wide angle lens of your story, just the play by play, this happens, then that happens because this happens, and going down the line. Really super big help, and it's really going to help you catch those big continuity errors with your story. Those are all the tips that I have for y'all to help y'all with continuity errors. Feel free to share any tips that y'all have in the comments below on different strategies that y'all use to help catch those darn continuity errors. And I hope y'all enjoyed this video. If you did, please be sure to give a like, and if you're new, subscribe. All right, y'all, thank y'all so much for watching. Take care. Bye-bye.